Very warm welcome to everybody. Lovely to see you. We've got quite a number of old faithful people who've been around ever since we started Speak Up for Our Planet, but we also have quite a number of brand new people who were excited by the idea of learning more about electric cars. So a good mixture. It's lovely to see you all. We are recording this. And we will be putting it on, or not the bit before this, but the actual talk we will be putting onto YouTube. So if there's anybody who doesn't want to be seen on YouTube, it's a good idea to switch off your camera once we start. Please, will everybody mute unless they're actually speaking, because we tend to otherwise hear dogs barking and all that kind of thing, which can be very disruptive. Just a few messages. We don't precisely know what we're going to do in January yet. We're keeping it a closely guarded secret. There will be a January meeting, but what we are going to do is not precisely for sure. We had the October meeting was cancelled, for example, so it's conceivable we might be able to get hold of the lady who was going to do that. If not, we'll find something else for you. We will definitely brighten up one of your Wednesday evenings in January, fear not. So for the time being, I'm going to invite Rosie to introduce our speaker.
Well, good evening, everybody, and nice to see some familiar faces now. So electric cars. Now, I heard Steve Forster talk about electric cars in September. A lot has happened since September, and I ended up with an electric car. So this man's quite dangerous, but in a very good way. So the thing that intrigued me about Steve was he's a very practical speaker. He's got over, he claims, 250 million miles in electric cars. And so he's been around them a long time. And he was a petrol head, so he does know his cars. But these days, apart from being a councillor for Hampshire County Council, he actually involved with Osprey Charging Network, which is one of the many companies involved in rolling out the infrastructure that we're all going to need. But he also advises government and public sector on electric vehicle trends and infrastructure. And as a speaker, he's here to help us with a bit of myth busting and a bit of insight into the whole business of how do I buy, how do I choose, how do I run an electric car. So we're going to ask Steve to talk for about 20 minutes, and then he's very happy to take all your questions, but we'll let him do his 20 minutes first. So with great pleasure, I'd like to hand over to Steve tonight to introduce the whole topic and tell us some key insights from what other people regularly ask him and he wants to tell people about. Steve.
Rosie, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to meet you all, even if it's virtually. As Rosie said, I've been driving EVs for quite a while, for about 10 years. And I do it because I want to save the planet single-handed. More to the point, I do it because it's nice and they're cost-effective. And I often get asked to share some of my thoughts and share some of my experience. Rosie gave me a bit of a briefing on the sort of people being a real mix tonight. Some who maybe have already researched it, some may be interested, and some may be those that actually think they're the devil incarnate as far as EVs are concerned. I'm well used to it. So what I'm going to try and do is position what the market is doing, position the key differences and the pros and cons and myths, do a bit of myth busting. I've got about 15, 20 slides, which hopefully isn't too many. If there's any urgent questions, I'm happy to take them as we go along, but I'd much rather if you can batch them up, and then I'm happy to spend as long as you want me for when we finish, until Jane and Rosie say no more, please. So I'm going to wade straight in with my presentation. I'll share my screen, put it on full screen mode. Okay. Hopefully you've all got that, have you?
No.
No? Okay, I've hit the wrong button then. Typical. Share screen again. Go back, desktop to share.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'll just go to full screen. Okay, I trust you can see that considering an EV intro slide. I can only see a small number of people here, so please forgive me if I don't see anyone waving a hand at me or anything. What I'm going to talk about is the revolution that we've really got, because this is about as major as going from the horse and cart to the car. It really is as fundamental a change as that. We're completely changing from combustion engines, petrol and diesel, through to electric, but there's an awful lot more happening at the same time, and I'll cover some of that with you. A key thing to bear in mind is the government has mandated in the UK that by 2030 you won't be able to buy a car unless it's got an electric motor in it, a new car. Obviously, second-hand cars will continue for some years thereafter, but no new petrol or diesel car sales after 2030 unless they've got some form of plug on them, and no hybrids after 2035. That is not far away. We're actually lagging behind some of the other countries in Europe, and Norway has probably done more to drive EV adoption than anywhere else. In Norway last month, almost every car sold had a plug on it. Hardly any normal cars were sold, and 85 were pure electric. That is remarkable, but is partly driven by the incentives that the government has put in. We've got incentives in the UK, but not the same. But they've done this for some years, and they're probably about 5, maybe 6 years ahead of us. And they already are at the point that almost half the cars on the road are electric vehicles. That is quite staggering. In the UK, we're way behind in terms of our adoption rates. But you can see on this somewhat cluttered slide, and forgive me for that, but the two key numbers I draw your attention to are the ones in red. Petrol sales are down this year by 10%. Diesel are down by over 60%. And electric cars are making up the difference. Battery electric, pure electric, are up by over 100%. They've more than doubled. And we're seeing that that trend is rising. I've covered some of the new vehicle registrations and things. I'm not going to go into detail. Again, another cluttered slide, but that on the bottom scale is a list of all the electric vehicles that are on the market in November. It's quite a huge number of different models. So one of the things people say to me is there's not much choice. There is now, but it's still a tiny proportion. 1 in 50 cars sold, 1 in 50 cars on the road is an electric vehicle at the moment. So anyone who does buy one at the moment is an early adopter, but not a real early adopter. They've become mass market, and we'll talk about that as we go along. So some terminology to start with. There are 3 types of EVs, so to speak. The one I'm really going to focus on is battery electric vehicles. They've got a plug, they don't have any other engine, they are a pure battery electric vehicle, and that is the way the market is going. You also have hybrids, and there are 2 sorts of hybrids. The ones on the middle column, the plug-in hybrid, which is a battery electric vehicle that also has an engine and a fuel tank to lug around, and a hybrid electric vehicle, the difference being that is what you may have seen from people like Toyota, the self-charging hybrids. That, I'm afraid, is pure greenwash. A self-charging hybrid is basically a petrol or a diesel car that has a tiny battery in it that might carry it a small amount of miles, but it's drawing the power from a petrol or diesel engine. So I'm really not in favor of most hybrid electric vehicles, especially the ones that call themselves self-charging. I think it's a con. Plug-in hybrid vehicles, perfectly acceptable, but you do have the problems that you've got both an electric engine and a battery, as well as a normal one. And a lot of people saw those 5 years ago as a transition until battery electric vehicles had good range. And we'll be talking about some of the range in a moment. But bear in mind, by 2035, those hybrid electrics will be banned. They won't be able to sell any new ones. So what are the pros and cons of EVs? Well, I've got a few slides that cover it, and I've focused on the red herrings and some of the things, the misinformation that's out there. So I'm just going to cover these quite quickly and then go through a bit more detail. Some people will say they're more harmful for the environment. You've got cobalt and things in there. It completely misses the point that ultimately they are better for the environment, because the total carbon dioxide damage, the total impact on materials is lower with an electric vehicle. There is a lot of misinformation out there. If you do your research, you can find the facts on that, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. The next thing you'll find is people will say hydrogen's the future. It is not. And there are four main reasons for that. Hydrogen, first of all, in terms of a source, most hydrogen that's commercially available comes from methane gas or natural gas. So it's a fossil fuel. It could come from water, but then there's an implication on cost, and there's an implication on the amount of power you need. If you're powering a vehicle directly by electricity, you're using a third of the energy if you had to produce hydrogen and then turn that hydrogen into power, into electricity. The costs also of setting up hydrogen infrastructure globally are going to be absolutely huge. That doesn't mean it's not going to be a fuel. It will be a fuel. It'll probably be used for trains, ships, maybe heavy goods vehicles, etc. But you're not going to see it as a normal personal car vehicle power ever, in my opinion, although you might do in 30 years' time, but I very much doubt it. The sustainability relates to the sources of it. It's very complex. When you turn hydrogen into power, you can do it two ways. You can burn it, but that doesn't suit a combustion engine and it's explosive, or you can turn it into electricity. What does that really mean? Well, if you've got hydrogen and you go through a fuel cell, you turn it into electricity, you then need batteries to store it and an electric motor to use it. So effectively, you still have an EV, you just have smaller batteries and a fuel cell and a hydrogen tank. It adds complexity, it adds cost. And that's why you're not seeing the major markets and the governments mandating hydrogen as the way forward. You'll hear people talking about depreciation and value. They'll say electric cars plummet in value. Actually, it's the opposite. Petrol and diesel are now plummeting in value. And the manufacturers are giving you huge incentives to buy them because they know come 2030, they won't be able to sell them anymore. And of course, that means the secondhand values are dropping fairly quickly. EVs, if you've got one at the moment, you might even find if it's one of the ones that's 4 or 5 years old, it's actually appreciating in value. I hear comments saying, well, I'm driving an EV, they're quiet. I'll run people over. I can't hear them. They all make a noise now. That was mandated. They're slow. Well, actually, they're faster than a petrol or diesel equivalent car, especially in that normal traffic type journeys. But EVs now are some of the quickest cars on the road. They accelerate briskly. They're nice to drive. People say they're difficult. Well, I don't think that's true. It's different, but it's not difficult. But there is a bit of a learning curve. And the one piece of advice I'll give you right now is actually do your research. I'm really glad you're on this call. Do your research, but try one. I've yet to find anyone who's tried it properly and doesn't like it. So what are some of the cons that people talk about? high purchase price. Well, it certainly was true when the only thing you could buy was a Tesla at £100,000. You've now got EVs coming down to below £20,000, very much on par with normal cars. And that price is dropping. Still a premium, maybe 10%, 15% more than a petrol or diesel car. But actually in total running costs, as I'll get onto later, actually the cost is lower over 3 or 4 years. But you'll find it pretty close to parity now. Classic one, range anxiety. I'm sure you've heard of it. What's the range of a car? Well, the first thing I would say is it's changed dramatically over the last 5 years or so. When I bought my first one, the range was 60 miles. My current car that's sitting on my drive outside will do about 320 miles on a single charge. Let's have a look at some of the ranges. And also, it's a little bit like miles per gallon. I know if you've got a car and you look at your miles per gallon, it's never what the manufacturer says. It's almost always less in the real world. It's a bit the same with EVs. So you'll find that a lot of cars now, as it shows on that table, are around the 200 to 350 mile range, 360. But actually, you'll get between 5 and 15, 20% less than that in the real world, pretty similar to miles per gallon. So just bear that in mind. The Mini is one of the worst ones. I know people who've bought a Mini saying, well, it says it does 145 miles. In the real world, it's 100. And bear in mind, that means you probably want to start looking to recharge it after 70 or 80 miles because you don't want to run it to empty. So just bear that in mind. But most of the cars on the market today will do well over 200 miles. And many of them are hitting 300, 350 plus miles. In terms of how most people use their cars, the average journey in the UK is 7 to 11 miles. That means on that level, you'd be filling up once every 2 or 3 weeks. And we'll talk about that a bit later. Doubts about the charging network are key as well. Yes, the charging network is not good enough. There are some vendors out there that actually have terrible charging reliability. There is an increasing number of chargers out there. There's a really good app or website you can go to called ZapMap, ZAP-MAP, which shows you where all the chargers are and all the different speeds of chargers. You will be amazed how many there are. And in terms of the rapid chargers that cover the motorway network and the trunk roads, there's a new site being installed pretty much every half day or so. Huge investment in this by councils, by government, and by commercial operators. It's a bit like Esso and BP and Shell in the early days when there weren't many petrol stations. They rapidly built them as cars got adopted. So yeah, you might have a few concerns, but that translates into the fact that you might have to look a little bit further on the map to find a charge point. Give it another year or so, it's not a problem. And I have to say, if you plan your journey, it's just not a problem. You hear comments about battery life concerns, that they only last like a mobile phone. They'll start degrading after a year. Most manufacturers, and it's different technology that's used in these batteries, most car manufacturers give a warranty on their car for 8 to 10 years. And the actual design life in a vehicle is double that. So 16 to 20 years. That's a heck of a lot longer than an engine in many cars, because they don't really get affected by mileage either. So you could happily have an EV, and many of them are now at 200, 300,000 miles without degrading. Interestingly, the manufacturers are making sure that the batteries themselves are modular so they can be upgraded. But I think that life is really important. And at the end of that life, they can either be fully recycled. Lots of manufacturers are building recycling plants to cope with the forecasted volume in 20 years' time, but also they can have a second life. A lot of these batteries will be redeployed into home batteries, so that if you've got solar panels on your house, you can have batteries and charge your batteries from the solar panels and actually use your own home-based electricity without having to draw from the grid. That's becoming more and more popular now, and it's a good use of these batteries in second life. There's not a lot of awareness at the moment of the technology and what's involved. Well, yeah, that is true, but some of the myths that fire services don't know how to put out a fire in an EV, they're just completely wrong.
Sorry,
They do.
it's all right. I'm just going to watch a Zoom meeting about electric cars.
Whoever that is, could you please mute your microphone? And I think one of the key things you'll find is the amount of training that there is, especially for car salespeople, is bad. By the end of this, or certainly after reading a little bit, you'll probably know more than most car salesmen. So just watch out for that. Okay. I seem to have had a glitch. So, yeah, sorry, let me just go back one slide. Okay, some of the positives, having covered all the negatives, they are fun. They are nicer to drive, genuinely. They're quiet, they're faster, they're more sprightly. They're just lovely, and they're new technology, and it's nice and easy to use. They are really easy to drive. They're all, you could say, automatic. They don't have gears. You just have a go pedal and a stop pedal. It's pretty simple. That makes them much easier. They're quite calming and comfortable. Some of them look a little bit unconventional, like the Tesla with its big screen. But you'll find if you go for something like a Mini or a Vauxhall e-Corsa or a Volkswagen, they're actually much more conventional. They do have nice displays on them, but they're conventional in terms of the instruments that you have and the controls. I'm not a fan of Teslas. I have owned a couple. I actually find them a bit too quirky. Some people love it, maybe a Scandinavian or American influence. A lot of them do have premium features, and quite often you'll walk into a dealer and they'll try and sell you all those premium features, and they'll overload you with information. A lot of the premium features you just don't need, but they're quite nice to have if you like gadgets. You've got a thermostat built in. We're pretty much mostly used to that, but there's a lot of car safety things built in, which make them actually far safer to drive than conventional vehicles. They are cheap to run. I'll come on to it a little bit later, but because you can charge at home if you have off-street parking, you get down to a running cost that is about probably a fifth or a quarter at most of a normal petrol or diesel car. Even if you can't charge at home, with councils putting in more and more on-street parking and with the availability of rapid charging, you don't need to charge every day, and that can give you a significant saving. I'm not aware of anything that is more than around half the cost of running a traditional diesel or petrol car. And there are offers, like with a Vauxhall Corsa, they just gave you enough electricity for 30,000 miles. They pay for it. They are zero emission. They're zero particulates, and particulates have been proven to be causing lots of problems. That's one of the reasons the government is stamping out fossil fuels. But also, it's just good for the environment. It's good for CO2. The overall CO2 production, including its lifetime use of power, is dramatically lower than trying to burn petrol or diesel vehicles in one of those vehicles. And they are big on safety. Most of them have got collision avoidance and crash prevention tools built in, things like blind spot warnings. Sometimes that can be a bit of an overload, as I said. When you go into a car show and they'll start talking to you about all those things, don't worry about them. Just focus on the basics. How do you drive it? How do you put it into park or reverse or forward? Does it drive? Then you can look at some of those, but don't get overloaded by them, please. So again, quite a complex slide, but there was a lot I wanted to cover on this. I've got some facts and figures that might be useful when you're talking to people. An EV will do about 2.5 to 5 miles per kilowatt of power. If you want an average, most EVs on the road will actually do 4 miles per kilowatt. There are a few different standards, but it's not like VHS and Betamax in the early days. There is now one standard cable for almost all charging in Europe. There's a different cable for Japan and a different cable for America. But there's one standard now for Europe, which makes life really simple. You'll hear talk of different charging speeds, slow, fast, and rapid, and even ultra rapid. And I've tried to use the numbers that are in there. You'll have 3 kilowatt, 750, 150, etc. I tend to discount that, and I just look at how many miles of range you get for every hour that you plug into a charger. And if you plug into your 3-pin socket at home, you'll get 12 miles of range for every hour you're plugged in. If you plug into a fast charger, which you can have, the government will give you a grant to get one if you've got off-street parking at home, you'll get about 28, 30 miles for every hour you're plugged in. So an overnight charge will give you a full tank effectively. And on a rapid charger, you'll get around 200 or 300 miles for every hour you're plugged in. So if you stop for half an hour to do your shopping at local Sainsbury's, and while you're parked at the Sainsbury's car park, you plug into a rapid charger, you'll get about 100 to 150 miles of extra range. And that's where a lot of people are going to be charging, at the Sainsbury's, at the library, at the community centre, at the health club, at the gym. Those are all the sort of places you're going to see rapid chargers, as well as pubs and clubs and restaurants. The ultra rapid chargers are what you'll find on the motorways, and they'll give you roughly 10 miles for every minute at the slowest ones, 25 miles for every minute charging. Now, if you put that into perspective, the average petrol station stop takes 12 minutes. So in 12 minutes, you probably put a tank full of traditional petrol in. With this, you'd add about 300 miles of charge. Pretty similar. I know that that's enough. 300 miles is enough for probably, what, 5 or 6 hours driving on a motorway. 4 if you're driving a little bit too fast. And I need to stop for half an hour about every 3 or 4 hours. So that's quite reasonable. You'll hear talk of battery size. The smallest cars now are 20 kilowatt, but most are in the 60 to 100 kilowatt. You can multiply that number by 4 to give you a rough range of the vehicles. So how long does a charge take? Well, 10 minutes on those really ultra rapid to 30 hours if you plug it in at home to a normal 3-pin socket. I've got the costs there. One thing to notice, a little bit like filling a petrol tank, when it gets nearly full, the rate of filling slows down, and it's the same with a battery. So from 0 to 80 or 90%, they're really quick, but then they slow down a little bit. And the last bit of charge takes a bit longer. So when you're looking to research what you should do, look at the finance. Look at the numbers, not just the purchase price of the car, but the total cost over the period that you'll be owning it. Especially if you keep your car for 3 to 5 or 10 years, an EV is definitely going to be the way forward. Do your research on the EVs. There's lots of useful things around. From if you watch satellite TV, there's Quest TV, Fifth Gear, the program with Vicky Butler Henderson and some presenters. They do some really good tests of EVs. But there's more and more YouTube channels and more information available. But do your research. As I said, a lot of the salespeople in the market aren't very good, sadly. Make sure you do get that familiarity. One of the things I've seen is the lack of training to use some of these new features properly. But here's a tip for you. Talk to someone who's got an EV. Most of them will be delighted to help anyone who's new to EVs, whether it's with charging, whether it's using the gadgets, whether it's using ZapMap or something like that, it's a lovely, lovely community of EV drivers. Take advantage of the grant to put in a home charger if you do have off-street parking, or if you live in a block of flats, ask your agents or your managers whether they will put in some charges. It does mean instead of 30 hours, you can do an overnight charge. And an overnight charge for most people is good enough for anything between 1 and 4 weeks use. And do make sure that you're on a good electricity tariff. It's cheap. Even now, the prices have gone through the roof for electricity, but they'll come back down quite dramatically, whilst petrol and diesel will keep going up. So a balance from my perspective of the pros and cons, well, it does depend on the owner. If you're the sort of driver who has a car and only maybe does 100 miles a month, you might be better off keeping it for the moment and in 3-5 years time switching to an EV. But if you're one of the normal users and you find, or you're looking to change your vehicle at the moment, you'll find that the whole life costs are significantly lower. I've listed them there. I'm not going to read them. You can read as well as I can. And the thing I would stress is they are nicer to drive, they are safer, and they are cleaner. So I hope that gives you a flavor. I'm going to stop sharing my presentation. I hope that's been useful, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions, which hopefully Rosie and Jane will help me with.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very, very much indeed. That was a load of information in a very short space of time. So I hope everybody will ask their particular questions or ask for clarification on anything you don't feel clear about. Put your questions in the chat is the best way, because we can't really see everybody. So putting your hand up, you might be waiting for a long time. So please do that. Put your questions into the chat. So as we wait for a few questions to turn up, I have I think it's a comment rather than a question. You talked about fast chargers and rapid chargers and so forth. In order to have a rapid charger, you have to have bought a car that does rapid charging, if you see what I mean, don't you? I mean, I have an electric car and I can't rapid charge because I made a conscious decision when I bought the car not to take the highest car in the range, and therefore I can't rapid charge. My car won't
Jane,
work.
you're absolutely right. Some of the earlier cars don't have rapid charging. I think nowadays pretty much every car on the market today has rapid charging built in as standard.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's normal. It was anything between 150 and 400 pound option, but as the ranges and the batteries have got larger, the manufacturers have standardized on it. I saw an announcement from Skoda, for instance, that although they had it as a 150 pound option, as of this week, they've now made it free. So you'll find that most cars have got rapid charging, and I would say it's definitely an asset to purchase one if you can that's got rapid charging. But pretty much everything on the market now has rapid charging as standard.
Okay.
Can I pick up some questions?
Yeah, do it.
Mark Longworth, you've got a couple of questions that are kind of related about specifically any resources to find the best companies to install the charging stations for an office car park and also domestic. So it's really sources of info about the installers.
Okay, well, a couple of things that I'd mention relating to that. There are grants for domestic chargers. There's also a workplace grant that will apply to any office charges that you put in. It's quite a considerable grant. It covers a significant proportion of it. In terms of installation organizations, it's very difficult to actually do that on a regional basis. I would always suggest you go to one of the local groups that you've got on Facebook, for instance, and ask them for local information. There isn't really a good major central source or repository of where there are good chargers and charging installers. But I would just check references more than anything else and ask people with EVs. They'll tend to, in your area, they'll tend to know the good installation companies and the good charger companies as well, because the selection of charger is quite important. People like Which Magazine and so on haven't yet got to doing that.
Okay, thank you for that. I think the other thing to say about the chargers as well is being very aware about your electricity supply as well. So if I have one neighbour who's putting in 2 and they have actually gone to 3-phase electricity as part of that. But they are a big electric car. It's his business is electric cars. So just be aware that if you hear people talking about, oh, you need to change your electricity supply, that certainly may not be the case in your situation.
I would say for almost everyone that's unnecessary. I mean, I have 3 electric vehicles at home for myself, my wife, and my daughter. We have one charger that we share. It's rarely in use because my daughter charges about once a month. My wife charges about once a week, and I charge about once a week. So we can share it.
Yeah, I think that's a very useful point, is people, any way you can share them as well tends to be very helpful. Penny asked, do you favour leasing or purchase given the technology is changing very quickly?
Most cars in the UK that are bought privately, or a larger proportion now, are bought on a lease or a PCP, personal contract plan. I prefer to buy my own vehicle outright because I have the cash available. And what I have found is I change my car every 12 months, actually, because I like having what's new, because that's part of my business. And actually, I've been selling the year-old cars for the same or more than I actually purchased them for because there's a waiting list for them. But I think it depends on your own finances, which is better. If you want a known monthly outgoing, a lease or a PCP may well be appropriate.
And can I pick up on that one, because it kind of almost related is from Catherine James, one of the barriers is the lack of a second-hand market. Could you comment on the second-hand market today for EVs?
Yeah, the second-hand market at the moment is quite small. As you saw, only 2% of the cars on the road are EVs at the moment. The ones that come on the market tend to sell very quickly and they get a very good price. That will change over time as more people buy them. But what you're tending to see is most people keep their EVs. They don't move them on because they enjoy driving them. So that's going to be a problem, I would say, for 2 or 3 years until there's a lot more on the market. It does lead you to buying new or nearly new ex-demonstrators, etc., which can be advantageous. But don't expect to get a bargain by buying a 1, 2, or even 5-year-old vehicle. They tend to hold their prices. They've stabilized on depreciation.
Okay, I'm going to take one more related to the price of cars from Ian. How fast is the premium for fully electric cars declining? Will that continue?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I missed it.
Yeah, how far the premium for fully electric cars versus a fossil fuel car, how fast is it declining, and will it keep declining more? Is there more to go?
There is some more to go. I think the price differential at the moment, as I said while I was presenting, is about 15% typically. I think that within 2 years, and industry analysts say that within 2 years, we'll have parity. But if you allow for the fact that things increase in price, in 2 years' time, all cars will be a little bit more expensive. So my recommendation is it's not really worth waiting, hoping that the prices are going to drop dramatically. One caveat to that, I think if you want to buy at the bottom end of the market, a smaller car or a hatchback or something like that, you'll see lower prices. And I think prices are going to fall by probably 5% a year, maybe 10% per year, certainly for the next 3 years. You'll see lower priced cars, partly because batteries and technology becomes more freely available, so that the manufacturers will sell more basic versions of the cars at a lower price rather than the premium versions, which is what they tend to be doing at the moment.
Okay, shall I continue with the questions, Jane?
Yep, go for it.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to move on now. I'm not forgetting David Chalmers. I could never forget David Chalmers. He is someone very close to my heart. But I'm going to move on to the batteries questions. And that is, how much battery chargers used in the winter night driving? That's from Linda Morse.
If you've got your car and you've got the lights and the heating on, you might lose between 5 and 10% of the range.
Okay.
It's notable that if you've got a petrol or diesel car, you'll probably lose 2 to 5%. People don't comment on that, but it does make a difference.
Okay. Catherine Jenner asks, are we likely to run out of some materials to make all the batteries we're going to need?
No.
Do you want to tell us why not?
Elucidate a bit.
A lot of the items that go into car vehicles are fairly freely available. Some of them are rare metals, but the use of those rare metals is decreasing. So we're seeing much less cobalt used. In fact, we're moving to zero cobalt batteries. There's new technology coming. Most of it is in plenty. Well, in fact, all of it is in plentiful supply. It's just the capacity to produce the batteries is probably the one thing that is least readily available. But most governments are providing huge incentives to the battery manufacturers, the people like LG and Samsung and Britvolt, to build new battery plants in much the same way as they provided incentives 40 and 60 years ago to build engine plants and to build oil refineries. The same is happening there.
Okay, this is an interesting question from Anne. Steve, you say that the old batteries from an EV will be used in homes with solar panels, but if the batteries are no good in a car, how are they going to be any good in a home?
Okay, it's not that they're no good. What happens when the battery reaches end of life for a vehicle, around the 20-year point, you might have 10 or 20% degradation at that point. So you might lose a little bit of capacity. At that point, you've still got plenty of capacity in the batteries themselves to power a house for typically 10, 12 hours. So that's why that's a second life option for them. There's also a thing called grid scale storage. You might start seeing some of these around at the moment. They look like containers that are plonked in a field next to an electricity pylon. Those use reconditioned or recycled batteries, again, to store power for the national grid and then feed it. So that in future, when we all put our kettles on after Coronation Street, instead of having to fire up a coal-fired plant or a gas-fired plant, which is what's been done in the past, they'll just draw that power from those batteries, and that will use those recycled car batteries. They might have a little bit less performance, but it's perfectly fine for those circumstances. And it's expected that the life in that scenario will probably be about 30 to 40 years before they need total recycling.
Okay, so basically cars are a premium use of the battery first, and then you go on to less critical performance.
Yes, that was a good way of saying what took me much longer.
One more battery question, and then I'm going on to another topic. What is the average lifetime of the main battery?
As I said, it's 16 to 20 years.
Right, I'm coming back to a slightly different topic now. I'm picking up David Chalmers' question. Do you think the argument that changing from petrol, diesel to EV personal cars is just prolonging the transition, and actually we should be moving to public transport without so much EV in the middle?
There's a big topic on that called modal shift, encouraging people to use public transport or active travel, i.e. foot, bicycle, e-scooter, scooter, electric bike. Those are all better, both for health and the environment. So I'd love to say, yes, wouldn't it be great if we all moved to public transport or active travel? The reality is it doesn't suit a large proportion of us. It doesn't suit goods transport, etc. So, you know, if you live in London, for instance, there's a fantastic bus network and a really good tube network. So public transport's great. You've got the train network if you want to go from London to Manchester, although that's expensive and capacity constrained. But we're not going to move away from personal transport. I do think we'll see more shared vehicle ownership as part of the transition. So in an ideal world, yeah, it would be great if everyone used to use public transport. It's just not relevant for probably half the population.
Okay, and now we're on to the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure challenges. I think it's a great question from Alan. Can you comment, Steve, on the infrastructure challenges for local government who want to install public charging on a big enough scale to satisfy needs for the 2030s?
Yeah, this is something that's very close to my heart as a county councillor. And I'm actually responsible in Hampshire for what we're doing on EV charging. The first thing I'd say is, for a lot of the EV infrastructure, there isn't a need for local government to pay for it. Commercial operators will do that and will do that very successfully. But local government does have great sites, great car parks that it can use to provide somewhere for those chargers to be located, especially for the rapid chargers. And of course, the on-street charging, I think local government does have a responsibility to deliver that, but it's not as large as people think. London is a great example of where local government, excuse me, has made some investment, has encouraged commercial investment. We're now seeing that seed funding that local government put in is being supplemented by major charge point providers like BP Chargemaster, like Engie, like my company Osprey, installing charge points, both with the council and with commercial operators. So it's something that we can talk about for hours. And if anyone wants to go into the detail, more than happy to do it. But I can tell you that government will make sure that there are enough charge points out there ahead of market demand.
Okay. One more battery question here from Raj. Is there a need for a spare charge battery? Have you ever been stuck because you haven't had a battery charge in it?
In 10 years, I've run out once, and I ran out 20 meters from my house because I'd pushed it at zero range. I pushed it, driving the car a little bit too far. Is there a need for spare batteries? No. Just like in a car, is there a need to carry a petrol can? No, but you can, but you shouldn't need it if you drive sensibly and fill up when you need to. Having said that, the AA, the RAC are starting to equip their vehicles with emergency backup chargers so that if someone does run out, they can turn up. Rather than having to tow them to a charge point, they can give them a little top-up charge, enough to get them the 2-5 miles to the nearest charge point. But bear in mind, you can plug in to a normal 3-pin socket. There's plenty of those around.
And I'd just like to say, earlier this year, the head of the AA was asked this question about, can the AA cope with EV? And he was saying that of all the calls, the calls out they have for EV cars going wrong, running out of charge was only 4% of all calls. And typically for petrol, diesel cars, the number of times they're called out from loss of fuel is 2%. So they're saying for a new technology, it is not so much higher, which is quite interesting. I think certainly.
I haven't heard that, Rosie.
Yeah. Good question from
Rosie,
John.
Rosie,
Yeah.
there's a question which has been just addressed to me, I think by mistake, so you won't be able to see it.
Okay.
Is conversion an option for old camper vans?
There are some companies that are doing conversions of all sorts of old vehicles, including camper vans, even the DeLorean, the Back to the Future vehicle, as well as things from Porsches, all sorts of vehicles. They are not inexpensive. Most of the conversions I'm aware of cost between £15,000 and £40,000. But that's certainly an option. And I'm sure that market will expand. One downside of that is you don't get the new features in the new cars, which do help with safety as well as just running on electric. But it's certainly something that you may want to look at. There's no mainstream organizations doing that. It tends to be small businesses doing those sort of conversions. I would be aware of them in the whole.
Yeah, there are ones that will also convert your vintage cars if you are having a vintage car you're worried about.
Yeah.
So John, a good point is this moment a Betamax VHS moment, and there's going to be a new technology come along in the future and, if you like, replace all of what we're doing?
I don't think that's going to happen from all the work that's been done by governments and vehicle manufacturers globally. We are going to see new technology in battery storage. At the moment, we're using technology that's been around and refined for some years. We're going to see a move probably over the next 5 or 10 years to solid state batteries, which will give effectively more range in the same size battery, or reduce the size and weight of the batteries, as well as increasing charging speeds. But it's something I think we're not going to see.
Hello.
We're not going to see that major shift for 5
Hold
to 10
on,
years.
I'm just watching a web.
Sorry, whoever that is, could you
Jeff,
please mute?
Jeff, could you mute, please?
Thank you. Yeah, so no, we're not at that point where everything that's being done is going to be redundant. We are going to see evolution, as you've seen with the motor car. Today's cars are very different to cars 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. You're going to see the same development in EVs.
And that leads to an interesting question from Helen. What are the bodies of EVs made from? Are they sustainable?
Most car manufacturers who are making EVs have designed their EVs to be the most recyclable of their vehicles. BMW and Volkswagen Group are probably more advanced in that than anyone else. I think they've said that their cars are currently 95% recyclable, and they're aiming for 100% within, I think it was 3 years at BMW, if I remember rightly. So you're seeing more recyclable, more use of technologies, even things like hemp being used in the interiors, and recycled plastics used for sound deadening and so on. So it's better. And we're going to reach full recyclability quite quickly. With EVs, it's a lot easier than with fossil fueled vehicles, where they use oil, and that contaminated oil is very difficult to deal with. I saw, it just stressed me, one of the comments, if I may, Rosie, someone asked me if I'm a little bit biased in my mention of particulates from electric vehicles. Tires and brakes give off particulates. They do, but it's worth noting that that's one of the things that's put out by car manufacturers wanting to sell their fossil fuel vehicles, which give out huge numbers of particulates. Tires and brakes do give off a small amount of particulates, but if you've got an EV, because when you slow down, you don't need to use the brakes most of the time. The brakes last dramatically longer, typically 4 to 5 times longer. And the tires tend to be eco tires that are designed to last much longer. So yes, they do give off some particulates, but anything that moves that's got a brake will.
And on that question, actually, Lewis Foster's asked another question about, does it damage your EV in any way if you drive using the brake regeneration all the time? So maybe you'd like to just explain a little bit about the regeneration system as well.
Yeah, happily. The simple answer is no, it doesn't damage your EV, and repeated charging doesn't damage your EV. When you drive, in most EVs, you have the opportunity to select one pedal driving. What that means is, instead of using the accelerator as an accelerator and the brake as a brake, it switches to using the accelerator as a speed controller. So if you press it down, you accelerate. If you keep it the same, you go at a constant speed. And if you ease off the accelerator pedal, the car will actually slow down, and it uses the electric motors to recharge the battery, which slows the car down. It uses that energy really efficiently. That's good for the vehicle, and it's good for your range. So it's a good time to use that all the time when you're driving. I never drive with my one pedal regen turned off. It's just on all the time, as it is on most vehicles. Some people do prefer it to turn it off. It's a bit like leaving your car in neutral when you're driving. It will coast. It's actually not great driving.
Okay, I'm conscious of the time. I know Steve has said he can stay at least another 5 minutes if people want to continue. Jane, shall we just extend another 5 minutes? We've got about 3 more questions.
Just finish the questions, and then I'd like to do a 2-minute poll at the end.
Okay, so if people can stay for the poll, that would be great. So Peter Halbrun's got his hand up. Peter, did you have a question that we haven't covered?
Yeah, well, yes, in the sense, I think perhaps our speaker has been a little bit too generous with his idea of how easy it is to charge at public charging. All the tests I've seen have always indicated that it's often problematic. You know where the points are, but you don't know, A, if they're being used by someone else and for how long, and B, whether the actual charging point is working. In other words, if it hasn't been broken down or is being serviced. And then you've also got the issue of different companies, possibly with different plans, and the one you go to, so I think it's not quite as easy. It's so much easier with petrol. You know exactly anywhere where there's a garage. You don't have to think about, are they open? Will the pumps work? And I think that's at the moment something you've got to do with electric vehicles, which is why personally I'm not going to buy one for at least another 18 months to 2 years, because A, there's nothing wrong with my current car, and B, I'd like the network really to get a lot stronger.
Okay.
Peter, I'll answer that, because it's a valid concern, and I think you're picking up on some of the press. Jeremy Clarkson is a good friend of mine, and Jeremy was one of those that loved putting out stuff on TV about how the charging network was poor and how they always ran out. Jeremy's got an EV now. The market has changed. There are still, as I said when I presented, there are still some unreliable chargers out there. There are some you still need to join a club or subscribe to, but the government has mandated going forward that you have to be able to use pay as you go. So doesn't matter, you can turn up and use any of them. Good charging companies, like, well, 70 or 80% of those on the market now will take any credit or debit card. The reliability is getting better. The rapid charger reliability has been bad with 1 or 2 companies in particular, but is certainly improving. But likewise, you get petrol pumps that do fail. Fortunately, with petrol pumps, you tend to find 4 or 8 or 16 at a time. You wouldn't go to a petrol station that just had 1 or 2. And it's the same with charge points. So now there is a move to charge points being in clusters, hubs as they're called. And that is removing that anxiety. But really importantly, and the most important thing I'd say to you, Peter, is if you go to ZapMap, with a lot of the charge point operators that are on there, you can see whether a charge point is working, you can see its reliability, and you can see if someone is actually using it. And that technology is now appearing in the vehicles. With my Ford, when I do a journey, the satellite navigation on it, I tell it where I want to go, it tells me if I need to charge, and it selects a charger that is available and working. So I think your concerns probably were valid 2 or 3 years ago. They might be valid with a few operators today, but it's not a reason I would not recommend buying a vehicle today. I think you're being excessively cautious.
That happens with
Okay.
old age.
Sorry, Peter, there's other questions. I'm afraid I'm going to have to move on to let some other people ask questions. Are there enough trained mechanics for all the EVs?
They don't need much work. So yes, most of the mechanics who can look after a car will need some additional training to cover the electrical systems, but the amount of maintenance they need is dramatically lower. You have no oil changes. You don't have to service the engines. So it's one of the other things you'll find, the running costs are significantly lower. You go in for an annual maintenance where they check the brakes are working, wipers and lights. That's it.
Okay. Question Catherine Jenner has been asking is, when you do actually recycle the batteries, how are they recycled? So essentially, what are they recycled into?
New batteries.
Okay.
Yeah, the battery components, the technology that goes into them is mostly recycled to make new batteries.
And one back to the councils, to your heart. What stops councils, private companies from putting a charger on each lamp standard in residential areas?
Cost.
Absolutely nothing. They could do it. It just costs about £4,000 per lamp column. And one of the things you'd find is that people don't, a lot of people don't like others parking outside their house. It's their parking space. So somebody with an EV will probably claim that lamppost, and the next one will be 100 meters away. So although lamp column charging is important, it's far from the be all and end all.
Yes, we're all creatures of habit. That's my lamppost.
Yeah.
And one last question. If regen extends your distance, what happens if you're on the motorway and you're not braking?
You've got shorter range. The faster you drive an EV, the more power you use. Exactly the same as with a petrol or diesel car. The faster you drive, the less miles per gallon you go. And it's the same. So if you're not extending your range through slowing down, you'll slightly shorten it. But the amount of range that regen will add on a typical drive is about 1 or 2% on your total journey. So it's not a significant difference.
Okay, and I had one other question on that, but it's gone out clean out my head as I was about to ask it. So I'll just ask the last one from the chat. Why are Tesla sockets different to all the others?
They're not anymore. Tesla have switched in Europe to the standard CCS, as it's called, rapid charge connector. So they are the same. However, and this is one fundamental difference, Tesla chargers can only be used on Teslas, whereas all the other chargers, of which there are probably 30 times more than there are Tesla chargers, can be used on all cars, including Teslas.
And the question I was going to ask you is, with all the technology on board an e-car, is it when you get, say, below 20% of charge, is the number of miles you've got less accurate, or is it like some petrol cars where the number of, it may or may not be an accurate gauge at that point as to how much you've got left?
It depends on the vehicle, on the specific car. I know that some car manufacturers, BMW on their early i3s, the range meter was called a guessometer. It was a guess and it wasn't very accurate. But I have to say, on Volkswagens and Fords and my wife's Hyundai, for instance, it's very accurate. if it says you've got 15 miles left, you can drive it down to 1%, 1 mile, and it's still going. I must be honest and say I haven't gone past that to know if it's got any reserve, but I don't want to take that risk.
Okay, well, I'd just like to say a really big thank you on behalf of everybody. Jane is going to get the poll ready for us now, but I'd like to say a very big thank you to Steve for coming tonight and hopefully answering a lot of questions for people. So if people would like to mute or unmute and just give a big hand of applause, that would
Thank
be
you
very,
so much.
very...
I've really enjoyed it and loved the questions. They're really, really good. Thank you so much.